a state district court judge in Washoe County, Nevada. I'm apparently the only one here that's not from Arizona. So I'm going to ask you to take a very deep breath right now.
All right. Would you introduce yourselves to us, please?
Hi, I'm Ben Phillips, and in addition to We the People, I'm also on my school's Model UN and speech and debate teams.
I'm Drew Allen. I'm an Eagle Scout and I play varsity baseball here at Mountain View.
I'm Aubrey Bradshaw and I sing in our choir and run on our cross country team. And our coaches are Lindblom and Mrs. Litzberger.
Well, thank you. This, of course, is Unit 6, what challenges might face American constitutional democracy in the 21st century. And your question is, Thomas Hobbes noted that life in a state of nature is, quote, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. How has the human condition changed over time, and how is that change reflected in our expectations of government? Should the principles of natural rights or classical republicanism guide policy changes designed to improve the condition of all people? And what are the most pressing domestic and global challenges facing Americans today and in the future? What policies can you suggest to address them?
People's material conditions are the primary driver of changes in the human condition and subsequent expectations of government. Republicanism's emphasis on the common good and freedom from domination by external forces should be the framework used to improve the conditions of all people by limiting economic inequality both domestically and abroad.
One of the critical causes of the American Revolution was the economic restrictions of the British government, such as limitations on colonial trade and increased taxation. Reflected in the Constitution, political rights such as the First Amendment's right to freedom of speech and the Fifth Amendment's protection of private property are prioritized over economic rights, with markets left largely unchecked.
As American capitalism developed, this lack of economic rights and restrictions led to the rise of monopolists like Carnegie and Rockefeller, who dominated the American economy by the end of the 19th century using horrid wages and working conditions. Inequality skyrocketed, and people depended on credit for their needs, unable to pay it off later.
The subsequent depression, coupled with a lack of social safety nets, demonstrated the necessity of providing economic rights to citizens. FDR's Second New Deal was the first breakthrough for these rights with the introduction of Social Security, the right to collective bargaining, maximum working hours, and higher taxes on the wealthy.
The demands of citizens will always be initially driven by their material conditions. Public policy should be aimed at fighting economic inequality as it creates high instability for the vast majority of Americans, while capital remains concentrated in the hands of the wealthy few. Natural rights philosophy's emphasis on the protection of private property preserves economic hierarchies.
Instead, we should use the classical Republican policy framework, prioritizing common good over the individual. Further, classical Republicanism's view of liberty as freedom from domination by government and external forces is better able to guarantee economic security than natural rights philosophies, which prioritize political over economic rights. As German economist L. Eswege states, even the widest political liberty cannot save us from being converted into a nation of unfree people.
The most pressing challenge Americans face today is still combating rising economic inequality. Completion of the Marshall Plan led to increased global economic competition, causing America to implement trickle-down economic policies that fueled growth at the expense of certain economic rights, increasing inequality.
Now in the late stages of the COVID-19 pandemic and subsequent recession, capital returns have rebounded at a record pace. However, capital was already concentrated in the hands of the wealthy few, meaning most Americans will be left out of recovery after having their savings wiped out, further increasing inequality.
To address this, America should adopt a living wage and institute tax reforms such as raising the inheritance tax to increase social mobility.
Globally, inequality remains issue number one, since inequality in less developed countries results in widespread poverty. High poverty rates drastically reduce quality of life for billions, and their effects also impact Americans. Poverty leads to increased susceptibility to pandemics due to unsanitary living conditions and higher migration rates.
Further, poverty leads to higher rates of conflict and terrorism as fascist leaders and extremist groups gain power amidst desperate living conditions as shown by Hitler's rise to power and Al-Qaeda's high recruitment numbers in war-torn and impoverished nations.
Poverty can be addressed through debt forgiveness by the IMF and World Bank. This is especially important now since economic growth in debtor countries has been stifled by the pandemic, leaving them hopelessly in debt to the developed world.
Too often, policymakers fail to address the root cause of problems. For them, the answer to immigration is stricter border controls. The answer to high crime rates is mass incarceration. And the answer to economic devastation is bank bailouts.
This game of political whack-a-mole has arisen from a failure to understand how our economic base creates the conditions for perpetual violence and instability. If governments exist to protect and provide for citizens, policymaking must be centered on the causes of crises, not their effects, in order to improve the human condition.
Very interesting, thank you. To what extent can or should the United States facilitate and even subsidize the administration of COVID vaccinations worldwide? And if it does so, will it create the perception among its own citizens that it is not serving Americans' interests first?
I would argue that the United States has a vested interest in preserving the global economy and stopping supply chain disruptions that accompany the COVID-19 pandemic. Sub-Saharan Africa isn't expected to have everyone vaccinated for many years now. And if vaccination efforts don't improve in that region, trade across the world will be slowed down because of it. Economic development needs to be across borders and it needs to be widely distributed. The United States should absolutely support those programs.
But the U.S., I think, needs to focus on its own citizens first. But as of right now, we're actually doing fairly well with that. In Arizona, for instance, they've already opened up vaccinations to anyone as young as 16. So most of the population is already getting vaccinated. But it is a priority to provide vaccinations to these poorer countries because especially when we're seeing down at the border right now, especially here in Arizona, a lot of these immigrants coming in, some of them have tested, we have around 20% of immigrants testing positive for the COVID virus. So providing vaccinations to these other countries will make it so that these populations that are coming to the United States are not testing as positive and not infecting our population.
And I think it's important to note that even here in Arizona, we're doing really well with getting these vaccinations distributed, especially in areas that wouldn't typically gain medical help, where reservations, for example, the Navajo Nation, they're getting those vaccinations that they need. And so I feel like we as a state are doing fairly well in getting that vaccination spread through.
Thank you.
Sorry, I had trouble with my mute button. So my question kind of goes into some of these policy issues. There is a significant tension between natural rights philosophy and classical Republican ideas when it comes to public policy. How do you see the tension between these two philosophies impacting the need for some of these policy changes that your presentation talks about?
Well, I think one of the problems right now is in focusing a lot on natural rights, we are protecting a lot of these private property. We're focusing a lot on private property, and therefore we're not doing what's best for the common good of the people. For instance, right now, when we're talking about something like the capital gains tax, where one of the significant loopholes in the capital gains tax is the angel of death, so-called the angel of death loophole, where if a person holding an asset dies and passes that asset on to their heir, then the asset then gets up to its current day value with no additional tax on that value. So we're protecting the private property of that person, but by not having a tax on that capital gains, we're allowing for this continual cycle of generational wealth.
I think it's important to note that we can have both if we blend it correctly, though, because with the natural rights idea of capitalism, we have people being able to rise, but I think it's important to note that we have welfare systems that, although they aren't perfect, still focus on that idea of common good. And so while we can fix those welfare systems and make them more effective as far as budgetary spending goes, it's good to note that we can have that blend if we are effective with our use of it.
So turning to global challenges, to which international organizations, if any, should the United States belong in order to work on those challenges?
I would argue that a critical organization for the United States to be part of is still NATO, in the sense that it allows us to essentially strengthen our international presence without necessarily committing unilateral acts of militarism. Our days of imperialism should be behind us. NATO allows us to check potential threats to the United States, like Russia, through the things like the Enhanced Forward Presence Program, which are currently being upheld to prevent Russian aggression against the Ukraine.
And in addition to NATO, I think still one of the biggest organizations we need to belong to is the United Nations, because the United Nations gives an international backing to the US when it's trying to provide things like human relief to certain countries. Like in Afghanistan, for instance, when with the US invasion, the UN came and started to repair roads in Kabul and start providing for the citizens that have been suffering for decades of civil war. And so the UN, when the UN is backing the United States in these certain conflicts, then it's not just a foreign country coming in to occupy another country. We have the international community backing the US, which gives it clout behind and authority in the region.
What would be necessary to get the IMF and the World Bank to forgive their debt? And to what extent would that alleviate, in practical dollars, world poverty?
It's hard to pinpoint a specific amount of leverage we would need to provide against the IMF World Bank to relieve some of these loans. However, it's important to recognize that the IMF is structured as an organization that facilitates international trade more than many, in the sense that it has an incentive to provide economic liberalization to many of the economies that it's seeking to help. However, the theory of economic liberalization would fail if these economies were to completely collapse under IMF assistance, even though it's supposed to be tending towards more liberalization policies. We saw this in Russia in the 90s. Their attempt at privatization eventually failed, and they haven't tried to return to that since. The IMF doesn't want other countries to follow that path and have their privatization efforts fail. That alone should be incentive enough for them to provide debt relief.
Thank you.
So continuing on with this idea of policies, I wanted to talk a little bit about trade. So do you think the United States should encourage or discourage trade with countries that are guilty of human rights violations?
I think we should discourage trade, but I think we should also go in and help the country. While we do have issues domestically, I think using our resources and using our State Department and diplomacy to go help those countries and not necessarily invade, but use those allies that we have, like NATO and the UN, to go in and talk with those countries to provide help for those citizens in order to further gain trade eventually as we remediate that situation.
But we have to be careful, because when we're implementing restrictions against trade, we also could be hurting the U.S. In China, for instance, we've heard about the ongoing genocide against the Uyghur population, and the U.K. just declared that that's a genocide, passing a law a couple days ago. But the U.S. relies on $558.1 billion in trade from China every single year. So it's not like the U.S. can just slap sanctions on China without hurting itself. So what needs to happen instead is there needs to be an international backing behind that to pressure China into stopping those human rights violations.
However, I would argue that economic sanctions and limitations on trade with countries that commit human rights abuses can be extremely effective. Before we invaded Iraq, we did place economic sanctions on them, and I would argue they were highly effective. They decreased Iraq's GDP by 15%, which would be crippling to any nation. So therefore,
Well, thank you. It was very entertaining. I would offer just a few thoughts. I think you were very provocative in a lot of what you said, and actually, it invited more. I gave you some follow-up, but it invited more follow-up than I gave you, and it was fun. You also have a nice way of using nice little, I don't know what the word is, catchphrases like political whack-a-mole. That make your your presentation entertaining and more fun. Keep in mind that, and you also do a good job of, I would say, answering the questions that you do know and masking the questions that you don't. That's a skill and an important one. And clearly, you know a lot about the topic. It's always helpful to be a little slower sometimes so that those of us who are listening can understand. And I would just offer that by way of a constructive criticism, but I enjoyed the interchange. Thank you very much.
I echo what Judge Snow said. I thought you guys had like a really, really deep knowledge and application of your policy issue and global problem that you're talking about. And I think that you are extremely well versed and researched in it. The one thing I was really intrigued about in your opening statement, I would have loved to have heard a little bit more, maybe applied to some of the other questions, was that issue of terrorism and conflict. Because I heard that, it kind of piqued my interest, but it kind of didn't continue in the follow-ups and everything. But I thought you did an excellent job. I enjoyed the fact that you had nice dialogue and debate between each other. I liked the energy that you brought forward and your excitement about the economic issues. And I enjoyed it thoroughly, and I did learn a lot.
So I'm consistently amazed by the different approach to this particular question and your focus on really the financial aspects and then poverty. I thought it was well supported. You brought in a German economist. You talked, I had written in here, you gave me a good timeline about different economic events that occurred. I agree, your pace, I would slow down just a bit. You're all very articulate. And so we want to hear every word. So just make sure you're breathing. And I liked your approach about, you've got to look at the root. And I actually thought you could focus on that even more. So my constructive criticism would be slow down a bit. Also, you use phraseology of I would argue, just argue it. You're the expert, you're talking, just say it. You're taking your position. I also like that strategy. You used it. It's really effective when two of the members take opposite positions and the third party comes in with a compromise. And Aubrey, you did it really with the question about tension, and then you came in and gave a compromise position. I thought that was very effective between all of you. And I really enjoyed it. And the one thing that I just kept hearing was your passion, and it came through on all levels. And it was remarkable. I enjoyed it a lot.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. Go ahead.
Oh, no.
I was just going to say thank you for sharing your afternoon with us, whatever time zone we're in now. And I would wish you luck today for the rest of the day and tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well done.